Barron Trump has been accustomed to the increased attention of others since childhood. Being the son of the President of the United States meant living under the spotlight of cameras, realizing that every action would be discussed, analyzed, and criticized. However, he never wanted to remain in the shadow of his father. It was important for him not just to have a famous name, but to independently build his reputation, developing his mind, erudition, and leadership qualities. Education has always played an important role in his life. He was well versed in political science, applied sciences, and social studies, which made him one of the most outstanding students at his university. He was regularly invited to various international conferences, offered to participate in exchange programs, and he gladly agreed, because he believed that knowledge of the world is one of the main components of success. One day, he received a special invitation. The University of Tokyo offered him to participate in a student exchange program between the United States and Japan. It was a unique chance to immerse himself in a completely different culture, study Eastern political and economic models, make useful contacts, and gain valuable experience. Barron knew that Japan was a country with deeply rooted traditions, but at the same time it was one of the most technologically advanced corners of the world. The opportunity to live there for a semester, meet the best professors and students of the land of the rising sun seemed extremely valuable. Having received the letter of invitation, he immediately agreed. All that was left was to prepare for the trip. There was little time to pack, but Barron was used to working at a fast pace. He carefully considered what he would need in Japan. He knew that the local dress code was reserved and neat, so he chose several formal suits for formal occasions, as well as more casual but elegant clothing. In addition to clothing, he carefully selected books and materials. He knew he needed to prepare before leaving, so he took with him several works on Japanese history and culture, as well as books on the region's geopolitics. He paid special attention to personal items that were important to him. Among them was a small silver cross on a thin chain. Barron had worn it since childhood, and for him it was not just an accessory, but a symbol of connection with his family, with traditions, with his inner convictions. The cross reminded him that regardless of life's circumstances, it was important to remain true to his values. On the day of departure, the airport was crowded with people. New York has always lived at a fast pace, and even in the waiting room you could feel the rhythm of the big city. Barron was standing at the check-in counter, waiting for his paperwork to be processed, when two of his friends stopped next to him. "Are you really leaving for 6 months?" one of them asked, shaking his head. "Time will fly by," Barron replied, checking the documents. "I hope you won't get bored among Japanese professors. They say they are strict." "All the better," Barron chuckled. "I like a challenge." When boarding was announced, he said goodbye to his friends and headed to the security area. The attention to him was special. Despite all his attempts to remain just a student, his last name spoke for itself. Many passengers recognized him, some exchanged glances, someone filmed him on their phone, but he had long ago learned not to pay attention to it. After going through all the necessary checks, he finally found himself on board the plane. The plane from New York to Tokyo was large and comfortable. Barron took his seat in business class, settled into his chair, and pulled out a book, intending to make the most of the flight. He loved long flights because they were a time for reflection, a chance to be alone with his thoughts, without noise, without cameras, without social media. Passengers filled their seats, flight attendants helped with luggage, announced standard safety rules. Everything was going as usual, and nothing foreshadowed the unusual incident that was supposed to happen in a few minutes. As the plane was getting ready to take off, a flight attendant approached him. She looked polite, but there was a slight awkwardness in her expression, as if she wasn't sure whether she should address him at all. "Mr. Trump?" she asked. Barron looked up from his book. "Yes?" "Excuse me, but I have a small favor to ask." "Which?" She hesitated a little, as if choosing her words. "We would like to ask you to hide your chain." Barron frowned. "What's wrong with her?" "It's not the chain, but the cross on it," she said carefully. Barron was even more surprised. What's wrong with the cross? The flight attendant held her breath for a moment, clearly aware of how strange her request sounded. Then she leaned closer and quietly explained. Our pilot, he has his own beliefs. He doesn't treat religious people very well. Barron leaned back in his chair, still not understanding why this should bother him. Why? The stewardess looked even more awkward. His son was once recruited into a cult that used religion for manipulation. He ended up losing everything. Since then, the pilot has not tolerated even a hint of faith. He believes that any religion is a way to control people. And he very much asked that passengers not display such symbols. Barron looked at her carefully. So he judges all believers by the actions of one group of swindlers? It's not for me to judge, Mr. Trump. She smiled weakly. I'm just passing on a request. Barron looked at his chain. It was small, neat, completely unobtrusive. It promoted nothing, violated no one's rights. And now someone thought he should hide it because someone else had personal prejudices. He thought about it. Then he looked up at the stewardess. Can you take me to the cockpit? She was surprised. Do you want to talk to him? Yes. The stewardess hesitated. She knew it was a bad idea to turn down the president's son, but the situation was also too unusual. Barron looked at her calmly, not demanding, not insisting, but in his eyes there was a clear understanding of his position. After a couple of seconds she nodded. Good. Follow me. The stewardess turned slowly and motioned for Barron to follow her. As he passed the rows of passengers, he felt curious glances on him, some recognizing him, some simply wondering why the young man had been allowed to walk toward the cockpit. Barron kept his cool, showing no irritation or emotion, but inside he was feeling strange. He couldn't understand why anyone thought it was okay to ask him to hide his faith because of a personal tragedy. As they approached the cockpit door, the flight attendant took a deep breath and knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened slightly, and the pilot emerged, a middle-aged man with sharp but slightly tired eyes. His jaw was tense, and his expression was slightly wary. He glanced quickly at Barron, then at the flight attendant. What happened? He asked in a low voice. A passenger would like to speak to you. The flight attendant replied with a hint of uncertainty. The pilot looked at Barron again, this time with more intense interest. Is it urgent? We're taking off in a few minutes. I won't keep you long, Barron answered calmly. The pilot sighed, hesitating, but finally nodded and opened the door a little wider, signaling for them to come in. The cockpit was filled with control panels, glowing indicators, blinking instruments. The co-pilot was focused on checking the equipment, but upon seeing his guests, he simply nodded briefly and continued working. Barron stopped in front of the pilot, looking him intently in the eyes. The man folded his arms across his chest and tilted his head slightly, as if studying him. Something wrong? The pilot asked, but there was already irritation in his voice, as if he already knew where this conversation was going. I was told that you were worried about my cross, Barron answered without further ado. The pilot pressed his lips together and leaned back, shaking his head. It's not your cross that worries me, it's that faith is often a tool for manipulation, he said. People hide behind religion to do terrible things. And frankly, I don't want to see religious symbols on board my plane. Barron narrowed his eyes slightly, listening intently. You have a right to your opinion, he replied. But I think you are unfair. You judge all believers by the actions of those who have used religion for their own gain. The pilot chuckled. Yes? And do you know what happened to my son? Barron bowed his head slightly, inviting him to continue. The pilot was silent for a moment, then sighed heavily, as if this story had been inside him for a long time, but he rarely shared it. A few years ago, he fell into a cult, he began. They promised him that faith was the only way to salvation, that the whole world was mired in sin, and that only they knew the truth. He believed them. He believed them so much that he gave them everything he had. He sold his car, sold his apartment, cut off contact with his family. They brainwashed him. The pilot clenched his fists, but his voice remained cold. When he realized that he was just used, it was too late. He had nothing left. They broke him. And you know what? They weren't even punished for it, because they hid behind religion, saying that all the donations were voluntary. Barron did not interrupt, listening to every word. He understood that for this man, faith had become synonymous with betrayal, lies, and pain. And you want me to calmly look at crosses, prayers, and sermons after this? The pilot finished, clenching his jaw. Barron paused, then said calmly, I do not condone those who use faith to manipulate people. But don't you see that your hatred is not for religion, but for those who have distorted it? The pilot looked at him, frowning. You're not angry at God, you're angry at the people who played on your son's weakness. Barron continued. But is it fair to judge everyone who truly believes because of that? The pilot frowned even more, but now there was less irritation in his gaze than thoughtfulness. Barron continued, feeling that he had struck an important chord. You are a pilot. You are flying this plane, responsible for the lives of hundreds of people. They trust you because they know you have the knowledge, experience, and ability to make the right decisions. Now imagine that someone once lost a loved one because of an inexperienced pilot's mistake and then said, I don't trust any of them anymore. Would that be fair? The pilot looked at him, now not with hostility, but with slight surprise. Are you saying that you can't judge everyone by the actions of individuals? Isn't that so? Barron replied. There are pilots who are excellent professionals, but there are also those who make mistakes. There are doctors who save lives, and those who are negligent. There are politicians who fight for justice, and those who lie. Does that mean we should reject the entire profession? The pilot was silent, digesting what he had heard. Why are you so sure about this? He finally asked. Because the world is more complex than just black and white, Barron replied. For a moment, there was silence in the cockpit. The pilot looked at him with a searching gaze, as if rethinking everything he had just heard. You don't look like a politician's son, he said quietly. Barron chuckled. I'm just a person who believes in reason and justice. The pilot nodded slowly. You know, maybe you're right. The stewardess, who had been standing silently to the side the entire time, smiled slightly. She understood that something important had happened at that moment. Okay, the pilot said, taking a deep breath. I won't ask you to hide the cross. That would be wrong. Barron nodded slightly in response, not rushing to answer. He knew that words couldn't change the past, but perhaps they could change the way people felt about it. Get back to your seat, son, the pilot said more gently. We'll be taking off soon. Barron turned and walked calmly out of the cockpit, leaving the pilot alone with his thoughts. Inside, he felt satisfied. He hadn't meant to convince anyone, but he had given the man something to think about. And sometimes that was more important than anything else. Barron walked out of the cockpit feeling like he had just had a difficult but important discussion. There was no anger or irritation inside him, but he knew his words had struck a chord with the pilot. People who have experienced personal tragedy are hard to convince with logical arguments, but if they are given time to think, they sometimes come to the right conclusions on their own. The stewardess walking next to him looked surprised, but there was respect in her eyes. She glanced furtively at Barron, as if she couldn't believe the young man was speaking with such dignity and calm. You really convinced him? She asked quietly as they re-entered the main cabin of the plane. I don't know, Barron answered honestly. But if he even thought about it, then the conversation made sense. The stewardess smiled and nodded as if agreeing with him. Your seat is over there, Mr. Trump, she said, pointing to his chair. Barron sat back down and fastened his seatbelt. He glanced out the window, watching the airport below come alive with lights for takeoff. The plane was preparing to take off, and the passengers were getting busy with their own business. Some were scrolling through their tablets, some were chatting with their neighbors, and some were already falling asleep in their comfortable seats. A few minutes later, the pilot's voice was heard in the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome to Flight New York, Tokyo. Our flight will take approximately 13 hours. The weather along the route is favorable. Please remain fastened in your seat belts during takeoff. Thank you for choosing our airline. Barron listened carefully. The pilot's voice was calm and confident, but at some point he caught the slightest pause that very second that indicated that the man was still thinking about the conversation that had just taken place. Soon the plane was moving smoothly along the runway, then the speed increased, and a few moments later it took off from the ground. The feeling of weightlessness in the first seconds of flight always seemed unusual to Barron, as if the world ceased to exist for a moment, leaving you alone with the horizon. He closed his eyes, letting his body adjust to the change in pressure. The steady hum of the engines could be heard in the cabin, someone was talking quietly behind him, and the flight attendants were starting to serve drinks. The flight was settling into its usual routine, but inside Barron, thoughts of the conversation with the pilot were still bubbling. How often do people judge the world by their own experiences? How many people reject religion, politics, art, or science based solely on the fact that they once encountered bad examples? Barron always believed that true power lies in the ability to think bigger, to see the nuances, to separate the personal from the objective. After some time, the same flight attendant approached him again. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, placing a small tray of drinks in front of him. "Water, please," he replied. She placed a glass of ice water in front of him, but before leaving, she leaned towards him a little. "I think you really convinced him," she whispered. Barron looked up at her but said nothing. There was genuine admiration in her eyes. "I've been with this airline for a long time," she continued. "He was always a very categorical person. Never made concessions on such issues. But you spoke to him as if you really understood him." "I wasn't trying to change his mind," Barron said quietly, raising his glass. "I just wanted him to see things from a different perspective." The stewardess nodded and walked further down the aisle with a slight smile. Barron took a sip of water and looked thoughtfully out the porthole. The dark ocean was already spreading outside, illuminated by the moonlight. It was symbolic, a huge space, full of secrets and the unknown, like human consciousness, which can always be expanded if only a person is ready for it. He didn't know if the pilot would change after their conversation. Perhaps he would simply forget about it in a few days, return to his old beliefs and despise everything related to religion again. But perhaps, somewhere deep inside, he would no longer be able to look at the world the same way. And if this is so, then this flight really became not just a flight, but an important point in someone's life. The flight had been going on for several hours now. The plane glided gently on the air currents over the vast Pacific Ocean, and most of the passengers were either asleep or immersed in their own activities. Barron sat by the window, watching the occasional twinkling lights on the plane's wing. He was trying to read a book on Japanese history, but his thoughts kept returning to his conversation with the pilot. Oddly enough, this dialogue left him not irritated, but rather curious. He was used to people having prejudices. It was normal, it was part of human nature. But it was rare that an adult who had formed his own views was willing to at least listen to arguments without immediately dismissing them. The pilot was clearly hurt by this conversation, and Barron understood that if a person began to think, it meant that he had already changed half. He put the book down and closed his eyes. Memories of his school days flashed through his mind, of learning to ignore the prejudices of people who saw him only as Trump's son. Barron knew that in the public eye he would always be a figure surrounded by expectations and prejudice, and this had taught him to be collected, not to show emotion, and always to respond calmly and rationally. Suddenly, a distinctive sound came from the speakers and the pilot's voice filled the cabin. "Dear passengers, this is your captain speaking. We are now flying over the central Pacific Ocean. Some turbulence is expected, but nothing serious. Thank you for flying with us." Barron noticed that the tone of his voice had changed. It no longer had the tense tone it had when he first announced it. It seemed to have become softer, warmer. It was almost imperceptible, but Barron caught the difference. A few minutes later, a flight attendant approached him. "Mr. Trump, the captain says that if you don't mind, he'd like to talk to you again." Barron raised his eyebrows in surprise, but immediately nodded. "Certainly." He unbuckled his belt and, following her, headed back to the cabin. When the door opened, the pilot was sitting in his seat, looking at the screen with the route map, but hearing footsteps, he turned to Barron. "Come in," he said, this time without the tension in his voice. Barron walked in and stood next to me, crossing his arms over his chest. "I've thought about what you said," the pilot began, looking at his instruments as if hesitant to meet his gaze right away. "And I must admit, I may have been too categorical." Barron didn't answer, giving him a chance to continue. "I held on to that anger for too long. Every time I saw someone with religious symbols, it felt like a reminder of what happened to my son. Like they were all part of that cult." He pressed his lips together slightly and tapped his finger on the control panel. "But you're right. It's not fair. People are different. I let my past control my present." The pilot turned to him, now looking straight into his eyes. "I can't say that I suddenly became a different person in one conversation, but I'll remember this flight." Barron nodded. "It's not about changing all your views at once. It's about allowing yourself to question your beliefs if they're preventing you from seeing the world more broadly." The pilot grinned and shook his head. "It seems I shouldn't have talked to you about this, but to a psychotherapist." Barron chuckled too. "In that case, I'm glad you had a free session." They both fell silent for a second, but there was no longer any tension in the silence. "Anyway," the pilot continued, "thanks for the conversation. I haven't often met young people who can argue their point of view so well without trying to force it on others." Barron smiled slightly. "I'm just trying to be fair." The pilot looked at him for a few more seconds, then nodded. "I'll remember this flight," he said again. "Perhaps even for the better." Barron nodded in response. "Glad to hear it." When he returned to his seat, the plane continued to fly in complete darkness, and somewhere ahead, the outlines of a new day were already beginning to appear. Barron looked out the window and thought. Perhaps this flight really had become important not only for the pilot, but for himself as well. Barron took his window seat again, fastened his seatbelt, and looked out the window into the darkness. Somewhere ahead, thousands of miles away, Tokyo was already glowing, the city where he would spend the next few months. But his thoughts were still here, on this plane, in a conversation with the pilot that had begun with prejudice and ended in a moment of honesty. He couldn't say he changed the man's worldview, things like that don't happen in a few hours. But he knew he'd given him something to think about, and that was important. Sometimes it doesn't take a long debate or an aggressive discussion to get someone to reconsider their beliefs. Sometimes it just takes one honest conversation, where both sides really hear each other. The cabin was silent, broken only by the quiet conversations of the crew and the soft hum of the engines. Many of the passengers were already asleep, lulled by the rhythmic movement of the plane. Barron, too, felt his eyelids growing heavier, but before he fell asleep, he remembered the pilot's last words. "I will remember this flight." This man was not his friend, they would most likely never meet again. But still, some invisible connection arose between them, a connection through understanding, through an attempt to see the world through the eyes of another person. He felt a light touch on his shoulder. Opening his eyes, he saw the same stewardess in front of him. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Trump," she whispered. "Everything's fine," he replied, sitting up straighter. She looked around to make sure no one was listening, then looked back at him. "The captain said he would like to shake your hand after landing," she said with a warm smile. Barron looked surprised, but nodded. "Tell him I'll be glad to." The flight attendant smiled a little wider and went back to the service compartment. Barron looked out the window again. The plane was beginning to enter the dawn zone, and the sky was gradually turning light blue and pink. He knew this day would be long and eventful, but right now, at this moment, he was simply enjoying this moment. Time passed, and soon the pilot's voice was heard. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. The expected temperature in Tokyo is 18 degrees. Thank you for flying with us. We wish you a pleasant stay." The plane was descending smoothly, the passengers were beginning to liven up, getting themselves in order before landing. Barron felt a slight jolt when the plane's wheels touched the runway, then a slight braking, and now the plane was already rolling along the taxiway to the terminal. When the announcement was made that passengers could leave the plane, he stood up, grabbed his hand luggage, and headed for the exit. Waiting for him near the cockpit was the same man with whom he had had a tense conversation just a few hours ago. "Good morning," said the pilot, extending his hand. Barron responded with a firm handshake. "Thank you for the conversation," the pilot added. "Thank you for listening," Barron replied. They exchanged brief glances of silent respect. "Have a nice time in Japan," the pilot said, releasing his hand. "Have a good flight," Barron nodded. He turned and headed towards the exit, feeling the first rays of sun breaking through the airport's panoramic windows. A new stage, a new country, new acquaintances awaited him. But he already knew that this flight, which had begun as an ordinary flight, had become something more for him. Maybe someday this pilot will see someone with a cross around their neck again, and won't think about the pain. Perhaps he will remember this conversation and understand that the world is more complex than the division into right and wrong. Or maybe everything will remain as it was. But one thing Barron knew for sure: he had done everything he could. And that was enough.